An old house has its own voice, but some whispers do not belong to the wind. The story begins when Carol, a graphic artist seeking refuge from the noise of Columbus and a past she was trying to forget, unlocked the door to the lakeside rental in Daggerlin. It was the only property she could afford, a 2-story salt box house perched precariously close to the water's edge, isolated from the nearest neighbor by a dense stand of skeletal birch trees. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and a damp chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. For the first few days, this was the sound of peace. The groan of the floorboards under her feet, the rattle of a window pane in its loose frame, the rhythmic, hypnotic hush of water lapping against the shore just yards away. She set up her workstation by the large picture window in the living room, the vast, gray expanse of Lake Erie, her only companion. The quiet was a balm, a stark contrast to the life she had left behind. She worked. She took long walks along the rocky beach, and she slept without the aid of alcohol for the first time in years, feeling the tight knot of anxiety in her chest finally begin to loosen. The first sign of intrusion was a scent. After a week, she began to notice a faint, out-of-place odor in the downstairs hallway. It was the smell of the lake, of decaying algae and deep, cold mud. But it was inside, clinging to the air with a damp persistence that defied logic. She scrubbed the floors, aired out the rooms, and burned incense. But the smell would always return when she least expected it, a phantom reminder of the depths just beyond her door. Then came the sounds. They started at night, subtle at first, a soft, dragging noise from beneath the floor, a wet, scraping sound that seemed to move along the foundation of the house. She told herself it was an animal, a raccoon or a muskrat seeking shelter from the cold. She tried to ignore the way the sound seemed too rhythmic, too methodical for any animal she could imagine. The scratching would stop the moment she moved to investigate, plunging the house back into a profound silence that was somehow more unnerving than the noise itself. She was starting to feel the familiar prickle of paranoia, the old fear that her mind was playing tricks on her, a symptom of withdrawal she had been warned about. She fought to anchor herself in logic, in the solid reality of the house around her. One morning, after a night of unsettling quiet, she sat at her desk, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the pale dawn light spread across the water. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a bright glare across the front of the house. She glanced up at her bedroom window on the second floor, and her breath caught in her throat. Sunlight glinted off a series of long, thin lines etched into the glass. They were on the outside, 3 parallel gouges, deep enough to catch the light, starting near the top of the pane and dragging downward before stopping abruptly in the middle. The window was a clear 15 feet from the ground, with no tree, no ledge, no possible foothold. There was no way for an animal to reach it, and there was no way for a person to leave scratches like that without a ladder she would have surely heard. Paralysis lasted only a moment, replaced by a surge of cold adrenaline. Carol dragged a dining chair to the wall, climbed onto it, and unlatched her bedroom window. The cold April air hit her face as she leaned out, heart hammering against her ribs. Her fingertips traced the grooves in the glass. They were smooth on the inside, rough and deep on the outside. A shiver ran down her spine, not from the cold, but from the tactile certainty. This was real. Her mind scrambled for a logical explanation. A tree branch? There were no trees tall enough on that side of the house. Vandalism. The idea of someone hauling a ladder through the woods in the middle of the night without making a sound, just to scratch a single window pane, felt more absurd than the alternative. She spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened alert, every creak of the house, every gust of wind sounding like a threat. The sense of peace she had begun to cultivate was ripped away, replaced by the old familiar paranoia that haunted her. The house was no longer a refuge. It had become a cage where she was the only occupant, and something was outside, testing the bars. The next day, she drove to the neighboring town and bought 3 small security cameras. The act of doing something, of taking a proactive measure, settled her nerves slightly. She was a logical person, a problem solver. If something was happening, she would prove it. She positioned 1 camera in the living room, aimed at the picture window, another in the downstairs hall where the algae smell was strongest, and the last in her bedroom, facing the scratched window. The cameras fed to her laptop, recording on a 24-hour loop. The first night, she barely slept, sitting up in bed with her laptop open, watching the 3 grainy black and white feeds. The house remained silent. Nothing moved. The footage showed nothing but empty rooms and the pale glow of the moon. The same thing happened the next night, and the one after. The absence of evidence was almost worse than the presence of a threat. The whisper of self-doubt returned, louder than ever. Maybe it was all stress. Maybe she was imagining the smell, and the scratches were old, only just noticed by her hyper-vigilant senses. On the 4th night, a dull thud from downstairs jolted her from a light sleep. She grabbed her laptop, her fingers trembling. The hallway feed was black, but the other 2 were working. She scrubbed back through the footage. At the exact moment she heard the noise, 3:17 a.m. The hallway camera's picture dissolved into a wall of hissing static, lasting for exactly 15 seconds before returning to normal. The room was just as it had been. Nothing moved, nothing out of place. She watched the clip again and again. The static was a denial, a hole in reality right where the proof should have been. Frustrated, she put on headphones and turned up the clip's audio, hoping to hear the thud that woke her. She heard only the harsh crackling sound of the interference, but underneath the white noise, almost imperceptible, was something else. A low, wet sound, a rhythmic gurgling. She tore the headphones from her ears as if they were burning, throwing them onto the bed. The sudden silence of the room was immense, a hollow void where the crackling static had been. But the sound remained, an echo in her mind's ear, a wet, gurgling texture that had tried to form the syllables of her name. A wave of nausea washed over her. She stumbled to the bathroom, her body trembling uncontrollably as she retched into the sink. This was not a house settling. This was not an animal. This was something that knew her, something that was actively trying to breach the veil between its world and hers, through the very technology she had hoped would protect her. In a fit of panicked adrenaline, she went back to the laptop, her hands shaking so badly she could barely control the mouse. She didn't save the clip. She didn't think to preserve the one piece of haunting, inconclusive proof she had. She deleted the entire day's worth of recordings, wiping the hard drive clean as if that could somehow erase the sound from her memory. The following days devolved into a waking nightmare. Sleep offered no escape, only fragmented dreams of dark water and a persistent, whispering hiss. Her work as an artist lay abandoned, her digital canvas blank, her creative mind paralyzed by a singular, all-consuming fear. The house, once a symbol of her recovery, had become her prison. She stopped leaving altogether, letting the groceries she had ordered rot on the front porch. She dragged a heavy armchair from the living room and wedged it under the knob of the front door. She taped a thick blanket over the large picture window, plunging the main floor into a perpetual, dusty twilight. She felt safer in the dark, where she didn't have to see the vast, placid surface of the lake staring back at her like a blind eye. Her phone buzzed with ignored calls from her therapist and concerned texts from her sister, all of them going unanswered. Explaining what was happening was impossible. They would think her sobriety had failed, that her mind had finally fractured under the strain. The isolation was absolute, leaving her alone with the house and the certainty of what it contained. On the third night of her self-imposed lockdown, exhaustion finally claimed her. She had dozed off in a chair in her bedroom, a baseball bat resting against her knees. She awoke not to a sound, but to a change in the atmosphere of the room, a subtle drop in temperature, a feeling of static electricity on her skin, the unshakable sensation of being observed. Her eyes, heavy with fatigue, were drawn to the scratched window. It was dark outside, the moon hidden by a thick blanket of clouds. For a long time, she saw nothing but her own faint reflection in the glass. Then, a shape detached itself from the deeper shadows near the tree line. It was tall, impossibly thin, its silhouette slick and dripping, as if it had just risen from the lake. It stood perfectly still on the lawn below, its featureless head tilted up, aimed directly at her window. A primal, childlike terror seized her, and she squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white on the bat. It's not real. It's not real. She held them shut for a full 10 seconds, then slowly, hesitantly, opened them again. The lawn was empty. The shape was gone. A single, heart-stopping beat of relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her weep. But the relief was instantly choked off by the smell. The overpowering stench of cold lake mud and decay was suddenly in the room with her, thick and suffocating. Standing in the darkest corner of her bedroom, dripping brackish water onto the old wooden floor, was the tall, thin shape she had just seen outside. For a frozen second, time stopped. The shape in the corner was absolute, a pillar of darkness and dripping water that absorbed all light and sound. The bat in Carol's hands felt impossibly heavy. Then the shape took a slow, deliberate step forward, and the spell broke. A scream tore from Carol's throat, not a word, but a raw animal sound of pure terror. She was on her feet without thinking, swinging the bat with all the force of her adrenaline-fueled panic. The impact was not the sharp crack of wood against bone she expected, but a dull, wet thud, as if she had struck a heavy bag of saturated earth. The bat sank into the creature's midsection, and a spray of cold, black, brackish fluid splattered across her face. It smelled of 1,000 years of rot. The thing staggered back a single step, emitting a low, gurgling hiss, but it did not fall. That was all the chance she needed. She didn't swing again. She dropped the bat, turned, and fled. She scrambled out of the bedroom, sprinted down the stairs, and clawed frantically at the armchair wedged under the front door. It wouldn't budge. Behind her, a slow, wet footstep slapped against the wooden floor of the hallway. With a final, desperate sob, she heaved the chair aside and burst out into the night. She ran, barefoot, down the long gravel driveway, not daring to look back, the cold stones cutting into her feet as she sprinted toward the distant, lonely light of the main road. The sheriff's deputies found the house empty. They found the armchair overturned by the front door, the blanket torn from the living room window, and a laptop open on a bed upstairs, its screen dark. They found a baseball bat lying on the floor, slick with a dark, foul-smelling liquid that crime scene techs would later fail to identify. They documented the scratches on the outside of the second-story window. In the corner of the bedroom, they photographed a large, dark puddle of brackish water that had already begun to warp the floorboards. The official report would state that Carol, found wandering in a state of severe distress by a passing motorist, had suffered a psychotic break, likely induced by the stress of her recovery. All the evidence, they concluded, pointed to a disturbed woman who had systematically, if unconsciously, created her own haunted house before finally fleeing from the terrors of her own mind. Her sister took her back to Columbus, where she was admitted to a private facility, her story dismissed as the tragic ramblings of a fractured psyche. The rental house in Daggerlin remained empty, put back on the market a month later at a significant discount. The strange, lingering smell of the lake eventually faded from the hallways. The puddle in the bedroom was sanded and revarnished, leaving only a faint, dark stain behind. The world moved on, leaving Carol's terror to be a footnote in the town's long and troubled history. But sometimes, on nights when the moon is hidden and the wind is still, the light from the empty house can be seen reflecting on the dark surface of the water, and the scratches on the second-floor window look deeper and fresher than they did before. Every town has its secrets, but some are not buried in graves. They are written in ink. The story begins when Arthur, a retired historian with a penchant for forgotten histories, arrived in Daggerlin. He did not come for the ghost stories whispered in the local diner or the rumors of something in the lake. He came for the facts. So his grandfather had been a name on a list, one of the men lost in the boathouse fire of 1908, and Arthur had spent a lifetime convinced that the official narrative, a tragic but simple accident, was a lazy and incomplete explanation. He rented a small, dusty house on the edge of town, far from the water, and methodically converted the dining room into a research hub. Antique maps were pinned to the walls, timelines were sketched out on a large whiteboard, and stacks of brittle, yellowed documents soon covered every available surface. The house smelled of decaying paper and his own pipe tobacco, a scent of academic obsession he found comforting. He was a man who believed in primary sources, in cross-referencing accounts, in the unassailable truth of the written word. The town's current anxieties over a missing girl were, to him, a peripheral distraction, a modern echo of a much older, more interesting silence. His initial research was met with a polite but firm wall of resistance. The town hall's archive was a study in deliberate omission, with entire years of records missing, especially around the turn of the century. The locals he approached were pleasant but tight-lipped, their memories conveniently failing when he asked about the town's founding families or the 1908 fire. They would talk about the weather, about fishing, about anything but the past. This secrecy only fueled Arthur's determination. He knew the pattern of a town hiding something. He shifted his focus from public records to private ones, attending an estate sale for the Withers family, one of Daggerlin's oldest lines. He purchased a heavy wooden crate filled with uninteresting agricultural ledgers and moldering almanacs, hoping for a single overlooked letter, a forgotten bill of sale. Back in the dusty silence of his rented house, under the glow of a single desk lamp, he found it. It was not in the ledgers. Wedged between the pages of a damp-stained copy of Poor Richard's almanac was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover unmarked, its pages filled with the tight, spidery script of a man from a bygone era. The ink was faded, the language archaic, but the words were clear. The diarist, writing in the late 1800s, spoke of the town's founding with a chilling reverence for the lake, referring to it not as a body of water, but as the provider, or the old man of the deep. The entries described poor fishing seasons and harsh winters with a palpable fear, as if the town had broken a promise. Arthur's heart quickened. This was not history. This was folklore, the very thing he professed to ignore. He flipped through the brittle pages, searching for a date, a name, anything to anchor the text in reality. He landed on an entry from the week after the 1908 fire. He expected to read of tragedy, of mourning for the lost men. The entry was only 2 sentences long. The old man has been paid his due. The lake is calm again, and the nets are full. The words on the page felt like a physical blow. Arthur, a man who had built his entire career on the bedrock of verifiable fact, read the entry again, and then a third time. His first instinct was dismissal. The diarist was clearly a religious fanatic, a product of a more superstitious time, using metaphor to describe a coincidental upturn in the local economy after a tragedy. The old man was just a folksy name for the lake, paid his due, a poetic way to describe the loss of life. It had to be. Yet the statement was written with such calm, transactional certainty that it chilled him. It was not a lament. It was an accounting entry. The fire that had taken his grandfather, the event that had been the central mystery of his family's history, was described as a payment. The thought was so monstrous, so contrary to his logical worldview, that he felt a wave of intellectual vertigo. He closed the journal, the scent of old leather and decay filling his senses, and for the first time, the silence of the house felt less like peace and more like a tomb. For 2 days, he didn't touch the journal. He tried to return to the official records, to force the narrative back into the comfortable confines of human greed and industrial negligence. But the diarist's words had poisoned the well. Every line in a shipping ledger, every faded newspaper report of a drowning, now seemed to hold a double meaning. He was no longer looking for a crime, but for a ritual. On the third day, he succumbed. He reopened the journal and began a new, painstaking line of research, cross-referencing the diary's claims with the town's financial records. He built a timeline, and a horrifying pattern began to emerge. Every major accident on the lake, every unexplained disappearance mentioned in the old papers, was followed within weeks by entries in the town ledgers, noting record-breaking fishing hauls and sudden, inexplicable prosperity. The correlation was too consistent to be a coincidence. It was a ledger of blood and commerce hidden in plain sight. Armed with this terrifying new hypothesis, he tried to approach the locals again, this time with more pointed questions. The shift was immediate. The polite evasiveness he had encountered before now curdled into something colder, more hostile. The librarian who had been so helpful a week ago could no longer find the keys to the historical archives. The proprietor of the general store was suddenly always too busy to talk. He felt their eyes on him as he walked down Main Street, the silent, unified stare of a town guarding its foundational secret. The isolation he had sought for his research was now a weapon being used against him. He realized they were not just unwilling to talk, they were waiting for him to leave, content to let him fail. Another outsider baffled by their silence. They knew he was getting close. He abandoned questioning the living and focused on the dead, deciding to investigate the genealogy of the most recent victim, Samantha Granger, to see if her family had any ties to the town's founding. It was a long shot, a historian's hunch. After hours spent scrolling through digitized county records online, he found her family tree. He traced her lineage back through the decades, his finger stopping cold when he found it. Her great-great-grandfather was the very same man who had written the journal in his hands. The connection was not a theory. It was a bloodline. Arthur stared at the genealogical chart on his screen, the name of the diarist and the name of the recently vanished child linked by a direct, unbroken line of descent. The blood drained from his face. His carefully constructed, academic world crumbled in an instant, replaced by a single, horrifying truth. The pact was real. The sacrifices were real, and it was hereditary. His grandfather hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered as part of a ritual, and the town had been feeding its children to the lake for over a century to keep the fish plentiful and the crops from failing. The musty air in his rented house suddenly felt heavy and suffocating, thick with the weight of 100 years of secrets. His historical project was no longer about the past. It was about an active, ongoing conspiracy responsible for a string of ritualistic killings. He worked through the night with a feverish intensity, no longer a historian but a detective, racing against a silent, invisible clock. He abandoned the town's official history and focused entirely on its lineage. Using the diary as his key, he mapped the genealogies of the founding families, the Withers, the Holloways, the Grangers, and cross-referenced them with the current town census. The results were chilling. The descendants of these families still formed the core of Daggerlin's power structure. The mayor was a Holloway. The head of the town council was a Withers. They were not just living in Daggerlin, they were Daggerlin. He felt a profound sense of being watched, not by a ghost, but by the living embodiment of the town's history. The feeling was confirmed the next afternoon. He returned to his car after a fruitless trip to the town hall to find one of his tires slashed. Lying on the hood, its single dead eye staring at the sky, was a large northern pike pulled from the lake just moments before. Its gills were still faintly moving. It was not a random act of vandalism. It was a message. That night, he knew he had to act. The polite warnings were over. His research materials, his very life, were in danger. He needed definitive, undeniable proof that he could take to an outside authority, something that couldn't be dismissed as the ravings of a paranoid old man. His mind kept returning to the Withers estate, the source of the journal, the ancestral home of one of the pact's architects. Guided by a desperate hunch, he waited until well after midnight, then drove to the abandoned property, parking his car down the road and approaching on foot through the overgrown woods. He slipped in through a broken cellar window, the air inside cold and stagnant. He moved through the darkness, his small flashlight beam cutting through webs of dust, until he found it, a section of the stone foundation that seemed newer than the rest. Behind a loose stone, he found a recessed iron ring. Pulling it open revealed a dark, narrow passage. At the end of the passage was a small, circular room. The walls were covered in rows of faded black and white photographs of men, women, and children, a silent gallery of the lost. In the center of the room stood a crude stone altar, and resting on top of it was a thick modern ledger, bound in the same dark leather as the journal. His hands trembling, he opened it. It was a list of names and dates, stretching back decades. The last entry on the page was Samantha Granger, with the date of her disappearance written beside it in neat, precise script. He turned the page. The next name, scheduled for the upcoming winter solstice, was not a child, but a man he had spoken to just days before. Sheriff George, lost. A sound from above, the crunch of tires on the long gravel driveway, shattered the cellar's silence. They were coming. Panic seized Arthur, a cold, sharp feeling utterly alien to his quiet, academic life. He fumbled with his phone, his trembling fingers barely able to operate the camera, and took a blurry photograph of the ledger's open page. It wasn't enough. He needed the object itself, the undeniable proof. Hefting the heavy book, he scrambled back through the narrow passage, his breath catching in his throat. He could hear the low murmur of voices from the front of the house now. He didn't dare go back the way he came. He found another way out, a small, filth-clogged maintenance hatch at the rear of the cellar that opened into a thicket of overgrown bushes. He crawled out into the cold night air, the ledger clutched to his chest like a prayer book, and ran, stumbling through the darkness of the woods, not stopping until the dim lights of his rented house came into view. Back inside, with the doors locked and curtains drawn, he laid the evidence out on his dining room table, the old journal, the copies of the town's financial records, and now the new ledger, a complete, unbroken history of a town feeding itself to a thing in the lake. He had the story. He had the proof to expose a century of ritualistic murder and bring justice for his grandfather. He could take the ledger and drive all night, be in Cleveland by dawn, and hand it all over to the state police. But his eyes kept returning to the last page he had seen, to the name written there, George Lost. He had come here for the dead, but now he was the sole guardian of a living man's fate. To flee now would be to condemn the sheriff, the one man who had shown him a modicum of decency, to a cold, watery grave. The historian's detached objectivity warred with a simple, human morality. He made his choice. He found the sheriff working late, the only light on in the entire town square coming from his office window. He let Arthur in, his face etched with a weary curiosity. Without a word, Arthur placed the old journal on the desk, then the financial records, and finally, the new ledger, opening it to the last page. He didn't editorialize or offer theories. He simply presented the evidence, pointing from one document to the next, drawing the bloodline from the 1908 fire directly to Samantha Granger, and then to the final entry. He watched as the sheriff's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to a dawning, horrified recognition. The sheriff leaned forward, his finger tracing his own name on the page, and in that moment, the lights in the office flickered once, twice, and died. The low hum of the refrigerator in the break room went silent. The only light was the pale moonlight filtering through the windows. The sheriff reached for the phone, his face grim. It was dead. Then they saw them, silhouettes standing in the street outside. The mayor, the head of the town council, and a dozen other familiar faces from the town's oldest families. They were not armed. They were simply watching, waiting, their presence a silent, inescapable verdict. The official report from the state police, filed weeks later, was brief. Responding to a welfare check requested by a concerned relative, they found the town of Daggerlin quiet and cooperative. The local sheriff, George Lost, had apparently resigned and moved away without notice. The rental home of a visiting historian, Arthur Crane, was found empty, his research and belongings neatly packed, as if he had simply finished his work and left. The town's leadership expressed polite, if unsurprised, regret at their sudden departures. That year, the winter solstice passed with an unnatural calm, and for the first time in decades, the surface of Lake Erie froze over completely, a smooth, unbroken sheet of black glass. True horror isn't in the shadows. It's in the familiar smile that's no longer quite right. The story begins when Frank, a man who had measured his life in 20 years of footsteps and postage stamps, started his route the day after the town meeting. For him, Daggerlin wasn't a place of buried secrets or lakeside monsters. It was a predictable grid of 478 mailboxes. He knew the rust patterns on every one of them, the specific creak of each garden gate, which dogs would bark and which would wag their tails. His mailbag, worn and molded to the shape of his shoulder, was a source of comfort, its familiar weight a constant in a changing world. The new town curfew and the ambient anxiety were an annoyance, a disruption to the sacred, unchanging rhythm of his daily routine. He was a man who noticed things, a new car in a driveway, a garden left untended, but he filed these observations away as simple town gossip, harmless data points in the placid life of Daggerlin. He prided himself on his normalcy, on being a part of the town's quiet, unassuming background. The change started on Holloway Street. It was a small lane, lined with older, well-kept houses belonging to the descendants of the founding families. As Frank turned the corner, the first thing he noticed was the silence. The Henderson's beagle, a creature of furious yapping habit, was nowhere to be seen. The wind chimes on the gable porch, which always sang in the lake breeze, hung perfectly still. No one was sitting on their porch. No sprinklers ticked across the manicured lawns. It was as if the entire street was holding its breath. The quiet was absolute, a stark contrast to the usual gentle hum of a weekday morning. He felt a prickle of unease, a feeling he dismissed as his own imagination, colored by the sheriff's grim warnings from the night before. He continued his route, the crunch of his own footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness. He saw Mrs. Gable standing in her rose garden. She wasn't pruning or weeding. She was just standing, her back to the street, perfectly motionless, facing the distant gray line of the lake. Frank hesitated, then raised a hand in his customary greeting. "Morning, Eleanor," he called out. She turned. The movement was smooth, almost fluid, but it was just her head and neck. Her body remained perfectly rigid, facing the water. She gave him a wide, pleasant smile, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were fixed, glassy, staring at a point somewhere over his shoulder. It was a perfect, polite smile, but it was utterly vacant, a mask of politeness stretched over something hollow. Unsettled, he quickly put her mail in the box and moved on. The image of her empty expression burned into his mind. The next day, he returned to Holloway Street. The silence was still there, even heavier than before. He opened the slot on the Gables mailbox to deliver the day's letters. The mail from yesterday was still inside, untouched. It was cold and inexplicably damp, and it smelled faintly of the deep, muddy bottom of the lake. Frank pulled his hand back from the mailbox as if burned, a reflexive action of disgust. He wiped his fingers on his trousers, but the phantom sensation of cold dampness remained, along with the faint foul odor of rot and stagnant water. He glanced at the Gable house. The curtains were drawn tight. The porch was empty. He looked up and down the unnaturally quiet street. A prank? It felt too specific, too personal. With a growing sense of dread, he moved to the next house on his route, belonging to the Holloways. He opened the mail slot. The same thing. The letters from the previous day were still there, untouched, and they carried the same impossible chill, the same scent of the deep. He moved faster now, a cold knot tightening in his stomach, going from one old family's mailbox to the next. The Withers, the Pickerings, the Lawrences, every single one was the same. It was a pattern, a silent, coordinated refusal of the outside world, an infection of cold stillness that had spread through the very arteries of the town he thought he knew. His routine, once a source of comfort, had become a sequence of terrifying discoveries. He began to see more than just the mail. Through the sheer curtains of the Hendersons' living room, he saw Mr. Henderson standing by the mantelpiece, repeatedly wiping a single spot with a cloth. His movements were smooth, precise, and perfectly even. Frank watched for a full minute as the man's arm moved in the exact same looping arc, over and over, his expression placid and unfocused, like a clockwork automaton going through its programmed motions. 2 houses down, he saw a group of 3 women, all from the founding families, standing in a backyard. They were arranged in a loose triangle, all of them facing the lake, their hands held loosely at their sides. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just stood as the cold wind whipped strands of hair across their blank, emotionless faces. They weren't waiting for anything. They were simply aimed. He finished his shift that day feeling like a ghost, a silent witness to a quiet, creeping invasion. He sat in his mail truck for a long time before going home, the rational part of his mind trying desperately to stitch together an explanation that made sense. A local cult? Mass hypnosis? A strange flu? Every theory felt flimsy and absurd. He couldn't go to the sheriff. What could he possibly say? The mail is wet and people are acting strange. He would be dismissed as a crank, another town eccentric, cracking under the pressure of the recent disappearances. He was utterly alone in his knowledge. He was the only person whose job required him to observe every single house, every single day, and the patterns were a language only he could read. He almost didn't go to work the next day, but the ingrained habit of 20 years was stronger than his fear. He loaded his mailbag and started his route, forcing himself into a state of numb denial. He would just deliver the mail. He would not look in windows. He would not notice the stillness. He turned onto Holloway Street and approached the mayor's house. Mayor Holloway himself was standing on the porch, waiting. He wore the same wide, empty smile as Mrs. Gable. Frank's heart pounded in his chest as he walked up the path, his eyes fixed on the mail slot. He didn't look at the mayor's face. As he slid the letters into the box, he saw the mayor's hand rise in his peripheral vision. Frank flinched, but the hand did not move toward him. It simply raised, and a single, steady finger pointed directly at Frank's chest. After a moment, the finger moved, turning slowly until it was aimed directly at the gray, choppy waters of the lake. The gesture was not a warning, nor was it a threat. It was a calm, silent invitation. Frank did not finish his route. He dropped the remaining letters back into his bag, turned without a word, and walked back to his mail truck with a stiff, unnatural gait. He did not run. He did not look back. He felt the mayor's glassy, unblinking eyes on him the entire time. He started the engine, his hands slick with a nervous sweat, and pulled away from the curb, the silent, smiling figure of the mayor shrinking in his rear-view mirror. He drove straight home, the second half of the town's mail sitting undelivered in the passenger seat, a dereliction of duty he had not committed in his entire 20-year career. He locked the front door, drew all the blinds, and sat in the dim, dusty light of his living room, the silence of his own house now feeling as menacing as the silence on Holloway Street. The invitation had changed everything. He was no longer an invisible observer of the town's strange transformation. He was a participant, a person of interest. His self-imposed prison lasted for 2 days. He called in sick to the post office, a rare event that earned him a concerned phone call from his supervisor, which he ignored. His world shrank to the confines of his small house. He peered through the slats of his blinds, watching the familiar mundane life of Daggerlin pass by, now tainted with a horrifying new context. He saw them everywhere now. He saw a man at the gas station across the street, standing motionless by the pump for 10 minutes, his hand frozen on the nozzle. He saw a woman from one of the old families pushing an empty swing at the park, her movements smooth and even, her eyes fixed on the horizon. They were hiding in plain sight, a quiet sickness that had consumed the heart of his town. They never looked at his house directly, but he felt their collective awareness of him, a low, constant pressure that made the air in his own home feel thick and heavy. The gifts started on the second night. He awoke to find a perfect spiral of smooth, wet lake stones arranged on his front porch. They hadn't been there when he had triple-checked the locks before sundown. The stones were cold to the touch and glistened in the moonlight, looking like a string of dark, unblinking eyes. The next morning he forced himself to check his own mailbox. It was not empty. It was crammed full of dripping, green-black seaweed, tangled and knotted, and it emitted the same foul, swampy odor he had smelled on the letters from Holloway Street. The message was no longer a subtle invitation. It was a persistent, invasive calling. The lake was reaching for him, using the very symbols of his life, his porch, his mailbox, as its conduits. His sanctuary had been breached without a single door being opened or a window broken. He spent the third night in a state of near total paralysis, sitting in the dark, listening to every creak and groan of his house. The silence outside was absolute. There were no footsteps, no cars, nothing. It was the silence of a town waiting patiently. Around 3 a.m., his throat dry with thirst and fear, he crept into the bathroom. He turned on the tap, the sound of rushing water a brief welcome shock of normalcy. He cupped his hands and brought the water to his face, the coolness a small comfort. He looked down into the porcelain basin. The stream of water coming from the faucet was no longer clear. It was turning a murky, grayish-brown, and the smell of algae and mud filled the small room. He watched, frozen, as the flow sputtered and stopped. A low, wet, gurgling sound echoed up from the pipes below. A single, long, pale finger, followed by another, uncurled from the darkness of the drain, gripping the wet edge of the porcelain sink. Frank scrambled backward, a strangled gasp catching in his throat. He fell against the wall, his limbs refusing to cooperate, his mind unable to process the sight. The hand, bone white and glistening with a dark slime, pulled itself further out of the drain, its long, thin fingers flexing with an unnatural fluidity. It was followed by a slender, jointless arm, then a narrow shoulder, the creature contorting and flowing out of the small opening in a way that defied all laws of physics. It pulled its head free. Last, a smooth, pale orb with no discernible features, save for two dark, deep-set hollows that seemed to absorb the dim light of the room. It landed on the tiled floor with a soft, wet slap, its limbs unfolding as it rose to a height that was impossibly tall for the small space. It did not move with aggression. It simply stood, its head tilting with a slow, silent curiosity, the same placid emptiness in its hollows that he had seen in the eyes of his neighbors. It took one slow, dripping step towards him. The paralysis broke. Frank kicked himself away, crab walking backward out of the bathroom and slamming the door shut. He shoved a heavy chest of drawers in front of it, his breath coming in ragged, terrified sobs. He spent the rest of the night huddled in the farthest corner of his living room, a kitchen knife clutched in his white-knuckled grip. He did not hear the creature attempt to break down the bathroom door. There were no sounds of violence, no crashing or splintering wood. There was only a profound, listening silence, punctuated by the soft, almost gentle sound of something wet being dragged slowly across the floors in the other rooms of his house. The smell of the lake bottom grew stronger, seeping into the furniture and the curtains until the entire house was thick with it. He sat there for hours, a prisoner in his own home, waiting for a confrontation that never came. He was not being hunted. He was being acclimated. The terror was not in a final, violent attack, but in the slow, inevitable certainty that he was no longer alone, that the barrier between his world and its had been dissolved from the inside out. Sometime before dawn, an unnerving calm settled over him, a deep, hollow exhaustion that felt strangely like acceptance. The fear did not vanish, but it was replaced by a profound sense of inevitability. The invitation had been delivered. The sun rose, casting long golden stripes of light through the slats of the blinds. The front door of the house opened. Frank stepped out onto the porch dressed in his crisp blue mailman's uniform, his leather bag slung over his shoulder. His movements were smooth, economical, and perfectly precise. He paused on the top step, turned his head to look back at the town, and a wide, serene, and utterly empty smile spread across his face. The frantic, terrified man from the night before was gone, replaced by this new, calm certainty. He felt no anxiety, no fear. He felt only a sense of purpose, of belonging to a new, quiet, and perfectly ordered system. He had a job to do. He walked his familiar route, every step even and measured. The world seemed brighter now, the colors more vivid. The dogs that used to bark at his approach now sat silently in their yards, watching him pass with a new, quiet understanding. He was the mailman, after all, a vital part of the town's daily life, and he had so many more invitations left to deliver. Children and animals see the truth. The tragedy is that adults have forgotten how to look. The story begins in the heavy silence that fell over Daggerlin after the town meeting. For the adults, it was a time of whispered conversations, locked doors, and a new, sharp-edged fear. For 9-year-old Owen, the world was simpler. It was the reassuring weight of his German shepherd, Crichton, leaning against his legs, the familiar grip of the leash in his hand, and the knowledge that as long as the dog was with him, he was safe. The curfew meant he had to be home before the streetlights hummed on, but that was the only concrete change in his life. He still explored the woods behind his house, he still read his comic books, and he still took Crichton for their long, meandering walks. His father, David, was quieter now, his face drawn and tense. But Owen had learned that adults often carried a sadness they couldn't explain. His anchor was the dog, a silent, loyal shadow whose instincts he trusted more than any adult's strained reassurances. The change began with Crichton, their usual walking path, a loop that led down through the woods and along the rocky shoreline of Palmer's Bluff, became a battle of wills. Crichton, who had always strained at the leash in his excitement to reach the water, now refused to go. As they approached the trail that led down to the beach, the dog would plant his feet, the muscles in his powerful shoulders bunching. A low whine would start deep in his chest, and he would pull back toward the safety of the trees, his eyes fixed on the calm, gray surface of the lake, as if it were a living predator. Owen tried to coax him, to tug him forward, but the dog's fear was absolute, a dead weight of animal certainty that Owen could not overcome. He had seen Crichton face down snarling strays without flinching, but the placid lapping water terrified him. Owen, trusting his dog's senses implicitly, abandoned their walks by the shore. They stuck to the woods now, keeping to the higher ground of the bluffs that overlooked the water, but even from a distance, Crichton was on edge. His ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds Owen couldn't hear. His nose twitched, sampling the breeze with a low, anxious huff, and he would growl. It was not a loud, aggressive bark, but a deep rumbling sound that vibrated up the leash to Owen's hand. The growl was never aimed at the water itself, Owen noticed. It was always directed at the darkest parts of the shoreline, the deep shadows pooling beneath the old, dilapidated pier, or a specific dense thicket of trees where the bluff met the sand. Owen started to see the beach through his dog's eyes, no longer as a place of fun and exploration, but as a borderland, a place of profound and watchful danger. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the trees, casting the lake in shades of orange and deep purple, Crichton stopped dead on the trail. The fur along his spine bristled. His growl was low and sustained, a clear and present warning. Owen followed the dog's rigid line of sight out over the water. Moored about 100 yards from shore was a small, unmarked fishing boat. It was not in one of the usual fishing spots. It just drifted silently on the darkening water, its engine off. There were 2 figures in the boat, but they were just motionless silhouettes against the dying light. They weren't fishing. They weren't talking. They were perfectly still. 2 dark shapes in a silent boat, watching the shore as if waiting for something to emerge from the trees. Owen instinctively dropped to a crouch, pulling Crichton down with him into the deep shadows of the fir trees. The dog did not resist, his body low to the ground. the growl in his chest subsiding into a tense, watchful silence. Owen peered through the branches, his heart thumping. The boat did not move. The figures remained like statues carved from the twilight. He watched until the last vestiges of light vanished from the sky, and the boat was swallowed by the impenetrable darkness of the lake. He felt Crichton nudge his hand with a wet nose, a signal to leave. Owen backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the spot where the boat had been, and they made their way home in the dark, the familiar woods now feeling alien and menacing. He did not tell his father what he had seen. The image of the silent watchers felt like a secret that words would spoil, a dangerous truth that belonged only to him and his dog. The boat became his obsession. Every evening he would slip out to the bluffs with a pair of his father's old, heavy binoculars, Crichton always at his side. He would settle into his hiding spot and watch the vast, empty expanse of the lake, waiting. Some nights, the water remained empty. On others, he would find it, the small, dark boat, drifting in a different location each time, a silent, patient sentinel. He started a journal, a small notebook where he sketched the boat's position on a hand-drawn map of the lake, marking the dates and times. He was no longer just a kid afraid of the dark. He was an investigator, a spy gathering intelligence on an unknown enemy. He noticed that on the nights the boat was present, Crichton's anxiety was a sharp, aggressive thing, a low growl constantly humming in his chest. But on the nights the lake was empty, the dog's fear was different, softer, more sorrowful, a low whine directed at the dark, empty patches of the beach below. One night, nearly a week after his first sighting of the boat, Owen was jolted awake from a deep sleep. Crichton was standing beside his bed, his tail giving a single, heavy thump against the mattress. He was not growling or barking. He was whining, a high, insistent sound, and nudging Owen's hand with his nose, pushing him toward the door. Owen looked at his alarm clock. It was nearly 2 a.m., hours past the town's strict curfew. His first thought was of his father, of the trouble he would be in. But the urgency in the dog's posture, the desperate plea in his intelligent eyes, overrode his fear. Crichton knew something. He had to trust him. Quietly, he slipped on his sneakers, grabbed a flashlight, and clipped the leash to Crichton's collar. The dog didn't pull toward the front door. Instead, he led Owen to the back, through the kitchen, and out into the cool, dark air of the backyard. Crichton did not lead him toward the familiar path to the bluffs. He plunged into the dense, untamed woods bordering their property, following a barely there game trail that Owen had never seen before. They moved through the darkness, the dog's powerful form a reassuring presence just ahead, Owen's small flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the tangled undergrowth. After 10 minutes of walking, the trees thinned, and the scent of damp sand and algae filled the air. Crichton led him to a thicket of reeds at the edge of a small, hidden cove, then sank to the ground, his body tense. Owen crouched beside him, peering through the wall of green. The moon was bright, casting a silver, shimmering path across the water, and in that path of light, something was emerging from the lake. It was tall and thin, its skin slick and black. It was the creature the sheriff had described. But it was not hunting. It moved with a slow, almost sorrowful grace, its long limbs carrying it onto the wet sand. It paid them no mind. Its featureless head bent down as it began to carefully place smooth, dark pebbles on the sand, arranging them one by one in a deliberate, intricate pattern. Owen remained crouched in the reeds, his breath held tight in his chest. Crichton lay beside him, the aggressive growl replaced by a low, confused whine. They watched, mesmerized, as the tall, black creature worked. There was no menace in its movements, only a quiet, focused deliberation. It moved with a strange grace, its long fingers selecting pebbles from the shallows and placing them on the wet sand with impossible precision. For nearly an hour, it continued its silent work, crafting an elaborate swirling pattern on the shore. When it was finished, it stood for a long moment, its featureless head tilted as if admiring its creation, before it turned and slipped back into the dark water, vanishing without a ripple. The cove was silent again, save for the gentle lapping of the waves. Owen waited, counting to 100 before his curiosity finally overwhelmed his fear. He gave Crichton's ear a reassuring scratch and crept out onto the beach. He approached the spot cautiously. The pattern was a beautiful, intricate spiral made of dozens of smooth, dark stones, each one perfectly placed. But it was not just a random design. A jolt of recognition shot through him. He had seen this exact pattern before. Samantha Granger, the girl who had vanished, had been obsessed with collecting stones from the beach. She would spend every recess arranging them on the ground, creating swirling designs just like this one. He remembered teasing her about it once. The creature had not been building something random. It had been recreating a memory. It was not a mindless beast. It was a witness, a mourner. And in that moment, Owen's fear of the creature dissolved completely, replaced by a profound and chilling realization. He connected the two images in his mind, the dog's sorrowful fear of the beach and its aggressive, hateful fear of the boat. The creature wasn't the threat. The silent men in the boat were. He tried to explain it to his father the next day. He spread his notebook out on the kitchen table, showing him the map of the boat's appearances, his drawing of the pebble spiral, and a sketch of Samantha making the same design at school. He spoke with the frantic, earnest clarity of a child who has seen the absolute truth. His father listened patiently, his face a mask of weary sadness. He put a hand on Owen's shoulder and told him that sometimes, when a person is sad and scared, their imagination creates stories to make sense of things. He said he was proud of Owen for being brave, but that he needed to stop sneaking out at night. He needed to leave the worrying to the adults. The dismissal was gentle, but it felt like a door slamming shut. His father didn't believe him. No one would. He was a child, and this was an adult's world of secrets. That night, Owen knew he couldn't give up. He needed proof. Something no adult could dismiss as a child's fantasy. He took his father's old digital camera, the one with the powerful zoom lens, and slipped out of the house after his father had fallen asleep, Crichton trailing him like a shadow. He knew he was in danger, but the thought of what had happened to Samantha and the image of the creature's silent grief on the beach pushed him forward. He returned to his hiding spot on the bluff. The lake was dark and still. He waited for what felt like hours, a cold wind biting at his cheeks. Then he saw it, the small, unmarked boat drifting into view, its engine silent. It stopped in the center of the cove below. He raised the camera, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the zoom, the lens extending with a soft whir. He centered the two dark figures in the frame. Looking through the viewfinder, his blood ran cold as the faces came into focus. They were two of Sheriff Lost's own deputies. The camera felt heavy in his hands, a cold, dense weight of impossible knowledge. Owen lowered it slowly, his mind struggling to reconcile the friendly, familiar faces of the deputies with the silent, menacing figures in the boat. These were the men who visited his school to talk about safety. The men who gave him a sticker once for wearing his bike helmet. The men who were supposed to be searching for Samantha. A profound, world-altering nausea washed over him. The structure of his world, the simple, childlike belief that the police were the good guys, crumbled into dust. He looked at Crichton, whose low growl had not ceased. and he understood. The dog had known all along. They were not watching for a monster. They were the monsters. He clicked the lens cap back on, the soft plastic snap sounding like a gunshot in the silence, and retreated from the bluff, Crichton moving silently beside him, a dark, protective shadow. He ran the whole way home, his lungs burning, the camera clutched tight in his hand. He didn't wake his father right away. He crept into his room and uploaded the single damning photograph to his computer, enlarging it until there was no question, no ambiguity. Then he went to his father's bedroom and shook him awake. David woke with a groggy confusion that quickly sharpened into concern at the sight of Owen's pale, terrified face. Owen didn't try to explain with sketches or stories this time. He just took his father's hand and led him to his room, pointing at the glowing computer screen. He watched his father's face as he leaned in to look at the photograph. He saw the initial frown of confusion, the squint of recognition, and then the sudden sharp intake of breath as the truth landed with the force of a physical blow. All the color drained from his father's face. He looked from the screen to Owen and back to the screen, the gentle, patronizing disbelief from the day before replaced by a stark, absolute terror. He finally believed his son. The decision was unspoken, but immediate. They had to leave. His father moved with a quiet, frantic urgency Owen had never seen before. He pulled 2 duffel bags from a closet and began throwing clothes into them, his movements jerky and efficient. He told Owen to pack only what was most important. Owen packed his journal, his comic books, and Crichton's favorite worn-out tennis ball. There were no raised voices, no panicked discussions. The house was filled with the sounds of a silent, desperate escape, the quiet zip of bags, the soft thud of drawers closing, the jingle of car keys being lifted carefully from the hook by the door. Crichton seemed to understand, staying out of the way, his body pressed close to Owen's leg, his tail low and still. They were a silent team, bound by a shared, terrible secret. Within 20 minutes, they were ready. His father took one last look around the house, a home filled with memories that were now all tainted, and then led Owen and Crichton out to the truck. They drove through the sleeping town, the streets empty and silent under the cold glow of the moon. Every familiar house, every corner store, now looked menacing, part of a conspiracy that had been hiding in plain sight. Owen watched the town he had known his whole life recede in the rearview mirror, a place that had been his home and was now a hunting ground. As they finally crossed the faded sign that marked the Daggerlin town line, a sense of fragile, temporary relief washed over him. They had made it. They were out. He looked towards the lake one last time, and in the moonlight, he could just make out a tall, solitary figure standing on the beach, its head tilted as it watched them go, a silent, unmoving guardian of the town's terrible secrets. The law is a thin line drawn in the sand. In some towns, the tide always comes in. The story begins in the sterile quiet of Deputy Mendez's patrol car, 2 weeks after the disappearance of the historian and the sheriff's abrupt, unexplained resignation. An interim sheriff, a humorless man from the county, was now in charge, but the real weight of Daggerlin's fragile peace fell on Mendez's shoulders. She believed in the law. She believed in evidence, procedure, and the moral clarity of her badge. But Daggerlin was offering none of that. The town was locked in a state of suspended fear, the disappearances an open wound that refused to heal. For Mendez, the unsolved cases were a personal failure, an infection in the community she had sworn to protect. While the rest of the town had succumbed to a quiet, paranoid acceptance, She continued to work, driving her patrols with a grim determination, convinced there was a logical thread, a human explanation that everyone was missing. Her world smelled of stale coffee and dashboard cleaner, a bubble of manufactured order against the encroaching chaos. She drove the empty streets during the long curfew hours, the sweep of her headlights cutting through the thick lake fog, the police radio crackling with a static that sounded like a whispering voice. The town's silence was the most unnerving part. It was not a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, watchful one. She felt it as she passed the houses of the old families, their windows dark and impenetrable. She felt it in the way no one met her eyes at the diner anymore. The town was keeping a secret from her, and her badge, once a symbol of trust, now felt like a barrier, marking her as an outsider in her own home. The first clue was not a footprint or a witness, but a symbol, painted on the decaying wall of an abandoned bait and tackle shop near the shore. She found it during a late-night patrol. It was a complex, spiraling design, drawn with thick, dark mud that was mixed with something green and phosphorescent, giving it a faint, sickly glow in the beam of her flashlight. It wasn't typical teenage graffiti. It was precise, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. Over the next few nights, she found more of them. One carved into the wood of the old pier, another formed from black stones on a secluded patch of beach. They were markers, creating a perimeter along the darkest, most isolated parts of the shoreline. Her cop instincts screamed that this was a pattern, the territorial markings of a gang or a cult. It was the first solid lead in a case built on whispers and shadows. One night, while investigating a new symbol she'd found near the old, derelict boathouses, she saw it, a faint, flickering light from within the most dilapidated structure, the one whose roof had partially collapsed years ago. It was well past 2 a.m. No one had any reason to be there. Her hand went to the grip of her sidearm. She parked the cruiser 100 yards away and approached on foot, her boots making soft sounds on the damp sand. She moved to a grimy, salt-stained window, wiping away a layer of filth to peer inside. A half-dozen local teenagers were gathered in a circle, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of several candles. In the center of the circle, painted on the rotting floorboards, was the same glowing spiral symbol. They were not talking or laughing. They were humming, a low, monotonous chant that was both hypnotic and deeply disturbing. And in the hands of the boy leading the chant, held up to the candlelight like a holy relic, was the small, tattered teddy bear that had belonged to Josh Maddox. The rotting wood of the boathouse door splintered under the force of Mendez's boot. She burst in, flashlight beam cutting through the dim, wax-scented air, her sidearm drawn and held in a steady, two-handed grip. The humming stopped instantly. The 6 teenagers turned to face her, their expressions not of fear or surprise, but of annoyed interruption. They were the children of Daggerlin's oldest families, faces she had known since they were born, but in the flickering candlelight, they looked like strangers. Her beam fell on the teddy bear, and her voice was cold iron. She gestured with her weapon for them to line up against the far wall. They complied, with a strange, placid obedience, their movements unhurried, their eyes holding a calm defiance that was far more unnerving than any panicked resistance. She kicked over their candles, plunging the room into the stark, unforgiving light of her flashlight as she waited for backup to arrive. Back at the station, the evidence was laid out on a steel table, the half-melted candles, a rusty knife, and the pathetic, mud-stained teddy bear. The interim sheriff, a man with no patience for Daggerlin's peculiarities, had already dismissed it as teenage theatrics. But Mendez knew it was more. She picked up a spiral notebook she had found tucked away in a corner of the boathouse. Its pages were filled with the same phosphorescent, mud-based paint as the symbols on the walls. The book was a ledger of sorts, It contained meticulous notes on the creature, referring to it as the Guardian or the Old Man. There were crude, yet detailed drawings of it, not as a monster, but as a skeletal, godlike protector of the town. A few pages contained newspaper clippings about newcomers and tourists who had passed through Daggerlin over the last year. The article about the visiting historian, Arthur Crane, was among them. His name circled in a thick red ink. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't an invocation. It was a hit list. The teenagers were not trying to summon the creature. They were trying to aim it. They were a self-appointed culling crew, a junior chapter of the town's ancient conspiracy, preserving their perceived purity by pointing the town's weapon at anyone they deemed an outsider. As she flipped through the pages, her flashlight beam caught a series of notes detailing their rituals. One entry mentioned receiving information about new arrivals and the best offering sites, from a source they referred to only as the Shepherd. Her mind instantly went to Sheriff Lost, to his weary resignation, his strange, almost reverent respect for the lake. The thought was a betrayal so profound, she felt it like a physical blow. It was impossible. He was a man of the law. He was her mentor. Dismissing the teens, the interim sheriff told Mendez to bag the evidence and file a report. He wanted it all buried by morning. In the quiet, empty office, long after everyone else had gone home, Mendez sat with the evidence bag containing the teddy bear. She couldn't shake the feeling she was missing something. She picked up the bear, its cheap button eyes staring back at her. Her fingers ran over the worn, matted fur, and she felt a small, hard lump deep within the stuffing of its torso. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She took a penknife from her desk and carefully slit a seam in the bear's back, pulling out a small, tightly folded piece of paper. It was a handwritten note, the script neat and familiar. It was a list of names, and at the bottom, in the unmistakable handwriting of former Sheriff George Lost, were the words, "He knows too much. Point the way." The small folded piece of paper felt heavier than a block of lead in her hand. Mendez read the words again, her mind tracing the familiar loops and sharp angles of George Lost's handwriting. The betrayal was so absolute, so complete, that it bypassed anger and settled in her gut as a cold, hard knot of certainty. Everything she had believed in, her mentor, her badge, the very concept of justice in Daggerlin, was a lie, a carefully constructed facade to hide a rot that went to the town's very foundation. The sheriff hadn't been a weary, overwhelmed public servant. He had been a shepherd, calmly leading his flock, and a historian from out of town had been the lamb for slaughter. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. The sheriff's sudden resignation, the convenient disappearance of Arthur Crane, the placid, unconcerned expressions on the faces of the town's most powerful families. They were all part of it. The interim sheriff, with his bureaucratic disinterest, would bury this note just as he had buried the rest of the case. She was alone. Her training, her entire career, had prepared her to operate within a system. But what the note made clear was that in Daggerlin, there was no system to operate within. The system was the crime. To follow procedure would be to become complicit. In the cold, fluorescent light of the empty station, she made a decision. She did not log the note into evidence. She did not file a report. She carefully folded the small piece of paper, slipped it into the inner pocket of her uniform, and took the rest of the evidence, the notebook, the candles, the teddy bear, to the station's incinerator, burning it all to ash. She would not fight the town's history with paperwork. She would fight it with fire. Using the meticulous notes from the teenager's own journal, she began to plan. The book had detailed their entire pathetic mythology, their ritual calendar based on moon cycles and local folklore. They were planning their next offering for the coming full moon, just 3 nights away. For 3 days, Mendez went through the motions of her job, a ghost in her own life. She responded to calls, filed reports, and nodded politely to the interim sheriff. All the while, a cold, calculated fury burned within her. She was no longer a peace officer. She was an insurgency of one. On the night of the full moon, she did not take her patrol car. Dressed in dark clothes, she moved through the woods on foot, her knowledge of the town's hidden paths now a tactical advantage. She visited every one of the ritual sites she had discovered, the abandoned boathouse, the old pier, the hidden cove. At each location, she worked with a quiet, methodical rage. She used a can of gasoline and a flare to burn the painted symbols from the rotting wood and scoured the stone markers away with a crowbar, erasing the blasphemous geometry of their pact. She was not just destroying property. She was severing their connection, silencing their prayers to the thing in the lake. She finished her work an hour before dawn and drove her cruiser to the highest point on Palmer's Bluff, the spot that overlooked the entire town and the vast, black expanse of the lake. She cut the engine and waited in the silence, watching as the first pale hints of morning touched the horizon. The town was asleep, wrapped in its corrupt and ancient peace. Then it came. A sound rose from the center of the lake, a terrible, drawn-out shriek of pure, inhuman rage and hunger. It was a sound of frustrated expectation, of a bargain broken. Lights began to flicker on in the houses below, one by one, a wave of panic spreading through the silent streets. The town's placid quiet was shattered. She had not killed their god. She had just reminded it that it was no longer being fed. In the quest to cure monsters, the greatest danger is becoming one. The story begins not with fear, but with ambition. Dr. Evelyn Reed did not come to Daggerlin to escape a troubled past or seek quiet solitude. She came to hunt a god. She set up her private, self-funded laboratory in a derelict fish processing plant on the town's forgotten industrial pier, a place of rust, rot, and the constant smell of brine. Inside, her world was a bubble of sterile steel and humming machinery, smelling of antiseptic and ozone. It was a stark, clinical fortress against the unquantifiable mythic darkness of the lake it overlooked. She did not believe in curses or local legends. She believed in apex predators, in unique biological phenomena, and in the untapped potential of regenerative cellular biology. Taped to the side of her main monitor was a faded photograph of a young girl with bright green eyes, lying motionless in a hospital bed. This was the source of Evelyn's ruthless, all-consuming drive. Her daughter. For weeks, her hunt was a study in frustration. The town's fear was her opportunity, the curfew her cover. Each night, she would guide a small, submersible drone into the deepest, coldest trenches of Lake Erie, places that had not been seen by human eyes. Her sonar would pick it up, a biological mass, impossibly large and fast, moving with an intelligence that defied her predictions. It would investigate her baits, cages of raw fish and blood, and then vanish, leaving behind only snapped steel cables and crushed equipment. She collected water samples that contained unknown cellular structures, evidence of a life form that did not belong in any known phylum, but she needed a physical sample. The pressure was immense. Her funding, cobbled together from what remained of her professional reputation, was dwindling. The calls from her daughter's hospice care facility became more frequent, each one a fresh twist of the knife. Time was her greatest enemy. She was not a monster. She told herself this as she recalibrated the drone's manipulator arm. her movements precise and detached. She was a scientist on the verge of a breakthrough that could rewrite the rules of life and death. She was a mother, willing to commit any sin, to break any law of nature, for the chance to see her daughter's eyes open again. The morality of her methods was a luxury she could not afford. The creature in the lake was not a god to be feared, or a secret to be kept. It was a resource, a biological treasure chest waiting to be unlocked. Her work was a race against the slow, inevitable decay of the person who mattered most to her in the world, and she would not fail. On her last submersible drone, the one she'd modified with a reinforced cutting claw, she finally made contact. The sonar showed the massive shape approaching the drone at an incredible speed. The video feed filled with a blur of smooth, black skin, and then the screen went dead. The connection severed. Failure. Again. She activated the emergency retrieval winch, the motor straining as it pulled the dead, heavy drone up from the crushing depths. She stood on the wet, slick pier in the pre-dawn chill, watching the steel cable rise from the black water, expecting to see nothing but a mangled wreck. The drone broke the surface, its lights dead, its body scarred with deep gouges, but tangled in the mangled steel of the cutting claw was something else. It was a piece of dark, rubbery tissue, thick as a car tire, and slick with a strange, oily fluid, and it was slowly, impossibly, stitching itself back together before her very eyes. There was no fear in her, only a cold, predatory exhilaration. Evelyn worked with frantic, precise energy, using a pair of robotic pincers to transfer the still writhing piece of tissue into a cryogenic containment unit. This was it, the source material, the key to unlocking nature's most profound secret. For the next 72 hours, she did not sleep. Fueled by caffeine and a relentless burning ambition, she subjected the sample to a battery of tests. The results were more than she could have ever dreamed. The cells possessed no discernible nucleus or mitochondria. They were more akin to a complex, symbiotic colony of microorganisms communicating via faint, rhythmic pulses of bioluminescence. Their regenerative properties were absolute. When damaged, they did not replicate. They simply reformed, drawing trace organic matter from their environment, even from the air itself, to rebuild their structure at an exponential rate. Working day and night, surrounded by the hum of her machinery and the endless, silent vigil of the lake outside her window, she successfully isolated the protein compound responsible. It was a complex, unstable enzyme that seemed to bond with and rewrite the host's genetic code, forcing damaged cells into a state of perfect, accelerated regeneration. She synthesized a serum, a small vial of fluid that glowed with the same faint, sickly green phosphorescence as the symbol she had seen painted around town. She held in her hand the holy grail of biology, a cure for decay, for disease, for death itself. But it was untested, its side effects a complete and terrifying unknown. No ethics committee in the world would approve a human trial. She looked at the picture of her daughter, her bright eyes now vacant, her body a prison of failing neurology. The hospice nurse had called again that morning. They were running out of time. The decision, when it came, was not a product of emotional debate. It was a cold, logical conclusion. There was only one available human subject, only one life she was willing to risk for the chance to save her daughters. It was her own. Her ambition had led her here, to the edge of a cliff, and there was no turning back. In the sterile white light of her lab, she prepared a single syringe, loading it with a heavily diluted version of the serum. Her hands were perfectly steady. She swabbed her own forearm with alcohol, her movements as detached and clinical as if she were preparing a lab rat for dissection. There was no hesitation. She was a scientist, and this was the final critical phase of her experiment. She pushed the plunger home, the cold, glowing fluid entering her bloodstream with a faint, icy sting. For a long moment, nothing happened. She felt only the familiar rhythmic thumping of her own heart. She monitored her vitals on the screen beside her. No change. A flicker of disappointment, of devastating failure began to creep in. Then she felt it, a profound, unnatural cold that started in her arm and spread through her entire body. A deep, cellular chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was not painful, but it was deeply, fundamentally wrong. She looked down at her left hand, which was resting on the steel table. A thin, silvery scar, a relic from a childhood accident with a broken bottle, traversed the back of her hand. She had carried it for over 30 years. Under her astonished clinical gaze, the old, dead scar tissue began to pucker and dissolve, the skin beneath it visibly knitting itself back together, smooth, pale, and utterly new. A low, breathless laugh escaped Evelyn's lips, a sound of pure, triumphant disbelief. It worked. The scar was gone, the skin of her hand as smooth and unblemished as a child's. Her impossible gamble, her career-destroying, ethically bankrupt obsession, had been vindicated in a single, miraculous moment. All the years of ridicule, the scorn from her peers, the quiet, condescending pity from her family, it all melted away. She was not a disgrace. She was a pioneer. She was a savior. With a renewed, almost manic energy, she returned to her work, her mind ablaze with the final calculations. She spent the next day refining the serum, purifying the compound, creating a single, perfect, life-giving dose, not for herself, but for her daughter. Hope, an emotion she had long ago cauterized, now burned with a brilliant, painful intensity. She could almost see her daughter's eyes fluttering open, could almost hear her own name spoken in a voice she hadn't heard in years. As the initial euphoria began to subside, however, she could no longer ignore the side effects. The profound, cellular cold did not fade. It intensified, a permanent chill that seemed to radiate from her very bones. The thermostat in her lab was set to a sweltering 80 degrees, yet she still shivered, her lab coat wrapped tightly around her. She checked her own vitals. Her body temperature had dropped to 94 degrees and was holding steady. The bright fluorescent lights of the lab, once a symbol of clinical clarity, now felt like daggers in her eyes, forcing her to work in a dim, crepuscular gloom. And then came the hunger. It was not a normal craving, but a deep, primal, and specific need. She found herself standing before the bait freezer, her stomach twisting with a ravenous desire that horrified her. With trembling hands, she took out a single, frozen herring, and with no thought or ceremony, ate it. The taste of raw fish and ice, a shockingly perfect satisfaction. The most disturbing change was not physical, but psychological. She found her focus drifting from her work, her eyes drawn constantly to the large window that overlooked the lake. The water, which she had viewed only as a medium containing her research subject, now seemed to be calling to her. She would stand at the window for long stretches of time, her mind vacant, feeling a strange and powerful sense of longing, an inexplicable feeling of homesickness for the cold, crushing, silent darkness of the depths. The lake was no longer an obstacle. It felt like a destination. It felt like home. She fought the urge with every shred of her humanity, focusing on the picture of her daughter, on the vial of glowing green serum that was her life's purpose. Finally, it was ready. A single, perfect dose, secured in a cryogenic transport case. This was it. The culmination of her life's work. The cure. She put on a heavy coat, the fabric feeling strangely abrasive against her skin, which had taken on a smooth, rubbery texture. She picked up the case. The cold metal felt warm in her unnaturally cold hand. All she had to do was walk out the door, get in her car, and drive to the hospice. It was a simple, mechanical act. She focused all of her will, all of her love for her daughter, into that single intention. She took a step. Her mind screamed for her to go to the car, but her legs, moving with a smooth alien certainty, turned her away from the exit and took a deliberate step toward the door that led out onto the dark, waiting pier. A war began inside her own skin. Evelyn's mind, the brilliant, rational, human part of her, was a frantic prisoner inside a body that no longer took her orders. She screamed at her legs to stop, to turn back, but the muscles did not respond to her panic. They obeyed a new, older, colder command. It was the most profound horror she could have ever conceived, to be fully aware, fully present, while her own flesh betrayed her, her body moving with a smooth, relentless purpose that was utterly alien. The cryogenic case containing her daughter's future felt impossibly heavy in her hand, a leaden anchor to a world she was being forced to leave behind. Her body walked her out of the lab and onto the long, splintered wood of the pier. The cold night air whipped at her face, and the smell of the deep water rose up to meet her, no longer a scent of scientific interest, but one of homecoming. Each step was an agony, a fresh wave of helpless terror. Her mind was a torrent of memories, her daughter's laughter, the feeling of her small hand, the bright green eyes that were now dull and vacant. She had done this for her. She had damned herself to save her, and now, at the final critical moment, her own biology was stealing that victory away. Her body carried her to the very edge of the pier, the black, choppy water of the lake just feet below. It stopped there, standing perfectly still, its head tilted down as if in reverence to the depths. The pull from the water was an overwhelming physical force, a biological imperative to return, to merge, to become. She could feel her own consciousness, her identity, her love for her daughter, all of it dissolving like salt in the tide. But in the final moments, as the new instinct prepared her body to dive, one single, brilliantly human impulse remained, a mother's love. With a final, monumental surge of will that cost her everything, she fought against the alien puppeteer. Her own arm, feeling impossibly heavy and resistant, rose into the air. It was not the smooth, fluid motion of the creature. It was a jerky, spastic, human movement, a final act of defiance. Her mind screamed one last command, not to save herself, but to complete her mission. Her fingers uncurled, and she threw the cryogenic case, not into the waiting water, but back, away from the lake, sending it spinning through the air. It landed with a soft thud in the tall reeds near the shore, hidden from view, a tiny beacon of hope abandoned in the darkness. The effort shattered the last remnants of her human will. The resistance faded. Her arm dropped to her side. Her body, now fully in command, took a single, graceful step off the edge of the pier and plunged into the cold, black water, vanishing without a sound. Miles away, in a quiet, sterile room in a hospice care facility, a night nurse was doing her rounds. She walked into the room of a little girl who had been in a vegetative state for 5 years, her condition unchanging, her future a flat line. The nurse checked the girl's vitals, adjusted her blankets, and turned to leave. A small, almost imperceptible movement on the pillow caught her eye. She paused, frowning, thinking it was just a trick of the low light. She leaned closer. She noticed that for the first time in 5 years, the little girl's eyelids had begun to flutter, and with that, their stories came to an end, leaving only one question to haunt you. If everything you trust begins to lie, your eyes, your neighbors, your own history, how do you prove who you really are? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read all of them. See you in the next one.